Hi, this is Module 5, Video 23. In this video, we'll create a TimeSpan parser. So let me just quickly create the classes we need so that we can get an idea of the API we're shooting for. Alright, so just to recap what I've done there, again we've just got a very simple API here, publicly anyway. So we've got a parser that returns a timespan, and what we want to be able to do in our exercise program document is specify timespans in this kind of format, in these formats here. So you can specify hours, which I don't think is useful, but certainly not in exercises, but I'll include support for hours, minutes, and seconds. And you can specify, each of those components on their own or in combination. So for example, 3 hours, 4 seconds. Or you can specify 3 hours, 4 minutes, 10 seconds. And for seconds, you can also specify a decimal point. So 3.5 seconds or half a second. Now I've taken advantage of the C# compiler's ability to recognize constants and do constant calculations at compile time here. So I've defined these constants here, and I'm using them just to make the code a bit clearer here. Because I obviously can't put a time span in here because it's not a constant. So instead I've used an integer, and I'm converting that integer to a time span here. Now the next test is just doing a very similar thing, except we're making sure that we're case insensitive. So you can specify, lowercase or uppercase M, H, or S. Next test, make sure that any white space between the components of the time span is ignored. And actually I've just thought of another test that we should do here when I get to it. So yeah, making sure white space is ignored, and then this last test checks various invalid scenarios. Most of these are obvious. The first two are certainly obvious. These ones here, you can't specify a fraction for hours or minutes, only seconds. And this last one here, even though this is valid here, the minutes need to be specified before the seconds. So what's going to happen is the timespan parser will match that, and it will return a timespan of 3 hours 10 seconds, but the input will be up to this point here, so it won't have consumed all the input, which is why my assertion here is checking that the result was unsuccessful unsuccessful, or it's not at the end. So for these four cases, it'll be unsuccessful, but for this case here, it won't be at the end yet. So that assertion will still hold. Now the other thing I thought of is around white space. So you should have to have white space between the components, otherwise it's a bit difficult to read. So those are our tests. Now let's look at the implementation. I think what I'm going to do is split this up into several private parsers, one for each of the hours, minutes and seconds, and then kind of compose those together in our public parser here. So let's see how this pans out. Okay, so there's my tentative implementation. Start with the easy stuff. An hours parser parses a number, and this is, by the way, this parse class is part of Sprash, and it provides a bunch of kind of built-in parsers, if you will. Number is one of those parsers, and that will just parse any number of digits into a string, and then we continue that with a parse of the character H, ignoring the case, and assuming they both match, then we return the result of parsing the original number into an int. Minutes is exactly the same, except we're looking for an M instead of a H. Seconds is very similar, except we're trying to get a double, so we parse a decimal instead and then use double.parse instead of int.parse. The tricky part here is combining all those three parsers into the actual parser that we need. Now you do have the option of using this style of syntax with Sprash, which I've found is very useful when you're kind of got one parser after the other several times. Otherwise you're forced to use then, and it just gets really messy really quickly. So what we've got here is, first we attempt to parse the hours using our hours parser, and importantly that's optional. So if the string doesn't include the hours component, then this won't fail, it will continue on with the next component, which is whitespace, which is why I've given this underscore as a name, because I'm just gonna, I don't need to access that, I just need to make sure that there is whitespace. However, there only needs to be whitespace if hours was provided, and we have a way of checking that through this isDefined property on hours. Because we've specified optional here, hours is an option of int, which is where this isDefined comes from. Now if it is defined, we look for any whitespace apart from a new line, because we don't want new lines in our time spans, and in fact we should add a test case for that. So backslash r \n and \rn, Okay, so we're looking for any amount of white space, which is what this many does. It will match at any number of times, including 0. But if hours is not defined, then we don't need white space. So I've got this parser.string here, which I don't really like, but I couldn't find an alternative. I just kind of wanted to return a parser that always matches and doesn't consume any input. And this parser meets that criteria, but it just seems like we should have a specific method for that kind of scenario. But anyways, we then continue on with minutes, and we do exactly the same thing really. And then seconds, also optional. Now because all 3 components are optional, we need to make sure at least one of them is defined, which is why we have this where clause here. So if you haven't defined at least one component, then the parser as a whole will not match. But assuming at least one's matched, then we'll select a new time span, and we'll use this getAllDefault method on the option, which I think should be more consistent with .NET and be getValueAllDefault. But there you go. And unfortunately, the constructor for TimeSpan that takes hours, minutes, and seconds does so with integers. And because our seconds component is a double, that doesn't help us. So I'm constructing a TimeSpan with the hours and minutes, and then adding on the seconds component through this fromSeconds method, which does take a double. So that theoretically is our TimeSpan parser, but let's run the test to find out. Wow, works. Excellent, let's make sure of that. I don't quite trust it yet. Yep, all tests passing. Well, cool. That worked out better than I thought it would. So I will catch you in the next video. See ya.